Little section in our church history study is a very familiar one, Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 and 3. Why don't we just read this together? It's at the top of your study guide. Exodus 20, verses 2 and 3 says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me.
Exodus 20, 2 through
3, exactly. And the reason that that's given there as a kind of scripture for us is that a big part of the Reformation, the first person you think about when you think of the Reformation is who? Martin Luther. Yeah, he like towers over everything because he's the one who lit the fire. I think it was John Huss, the Morning Star of the Reformation, but Luther's the one who actually got everything going in the direction that it finally went. But alongside him, he was in Germany, of course, but alongside him was another Reformation going on in Switzerland. And so the last few weeks we've been talking about what the nature of that Reformation was there. Luther's standpoint had more to do with looking at it from the standpoint of justification by faith alone and things that we're really familiar with there. But Zwingli and Calvin, Zwingli was a contemporary of Luther, really had this idea of the church needing to be rid of its idolatry as well. So not only did the doctrine need to be reformed, but the practice needed to be reformed. Luther was okay with a lot of extra stuff. He was okay with vestments, he was okay with organs, he was okay with altars and crucifixes and things like that. But when Zwingli comes along, and we've talked about him the last couple of weeks, so we won't belabor the point there, it's almost like a really far swing of the pendulum to get away from the popish practices of the Roman Catholic Church. He basically, to quote one writer, one person at the time, said, we don't have churches anymore, we have stables, because of all the stuff had been taken out, all the pictures, all the statuary, all of the accoutrement of what it meant to be a church in the Middle Ages was now painted over and plastered over and whitewashed. And so the churches of the Swiss Reformation became more known for their plainness and very little ornamentation left. And so Zwingli, we mentioned also, he's the one that sat across the table from Luther, and they had this big disagreement over the nature of the Lord's Supper, and it issued in Luther carving into the wooden table, "This is my body." Period. End of discussion, no argument. And where Zwingli was advocating for what view? We talked about this a little bit last week. I'm not going to get into all the different views tonight because we went over that last week, but yeah, the memorial view, or the mere symbolic view. Okay, that was full of markers and erasers.
Kids played.
No one in here.
Huh?
Not here.
Well, they're
When
all
I
gone.
brought it down, it was.
Oh.
I mean, that was before anything happened tonight.
Are they right there in front of the hymnals?
Yes.
I bet that was for security. But speaking of kids being in here, somebody
Good.
probably moved them out.
Teacher thing I can always tell them.
That's good.
It's like a fifth sense.
You can smell it.
You can smell them.
Yeah. So Zwingli Zwingli. That's how you would say it, Zwingli. Had the mere symbolic or memorial view. And this is probably the view that we're most well acquainted with, because it's right there in the text. This do in remembrance of me. Luther would not go that way, and saw a lot more in it than Zwingli did. So that brings us to a second generation of reformers. And what happened with the second generation of reformers was the focus of the Reformation really did shift to Switzerland. And it began to focus on a very quiet guy who didn't want to be in the spotlight and was not a big personality, and he preferred the quiet life of the scholar but was thrust into the spotlight, and it was a man by the name of John Calvin, or if went by his French name or spelling, Jean Calvin. And he is probably the most reluctant reformer that there ever was. Did I tell you that Zwingli died in battle? Did we talk about that? Okay. So Zwingli is this really big brand. He's a warrior type. He is a chaplain in the Swiss Army. In the Swiss Army, we didn't. I don't know if you remember we talked about this or not. That's where the pocket knives came from. They were mercenaries and highly desired by every country in the world to fight on their behalf, and that presented a lot of unique problems for them. But so Zwingli was in the middle of that and died in battle. But the person who really took up the mantle then for the Swiss Reformation is John Calvin, born in 1509. So he's just a very young man. I mean, when Luther's nailing his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door, Calvin's about 8. So while there's a little overlap there, you definitely see how the generation marker falls. And interestingly enough, if you've got your study guide, let's see, cover here. Okay. Interestingly enough, what did Luther's dad want him to be? Do you remember? You ever talk of him? He wanted him to be a lawyer. And so instead of being a lawyer, because why? A lawyer, you take care of your dear old parents in their old age. You'll be wealthy, successful. And instead he goes to study theology, where Calvin's father actually wanted him to study theology. And he ends up initially studying the law before he goes back to theology. So, and that had to do with his dad's desire too. His dad had a falling out with the local bishop, and so he sends him to law school instead of theology school. So during this period of studies, Calvin begins to be influenced by the things that were going on in the day, and that was this the new humanism that was happening. And that wasn't a bad word. When we think of humanism, what do we automatically think of? Secularism, secular humanism. This is the humanism that pointed to the humanities of art and literature and religion and the classics. You remember the clarion call of the Renaissance, or of this time period, was to the sources, the scholarly people, the scholastic movement, I should say. Ad fontes, back to the sources. So they're discovering all this stuff from ancient Rome, Latin works and Greek works and things. And that had all been just buried, essentially. And now it's coming to the surface, and they're finding out all kinds of things. So Calvin is born into this time when all of this is new. And we've already talked about how the printing press was probably way less than 100 years old, 50 years old maybe. And so things are being printed, books are being printed. So he along with Luther and others are drawn, among other things, they're drawn to the Bible and begin looking to the Bible as the basis for their doctrine, their theology. And so in the due course of time, Calvin experiences this sudden conversion in which he describes it this way, that God subdued my heart to teachableness. That's an interesting way to describe conversion, isn't it? God subdued my heart to teachableness, rather. So he comes under some scrutiny by King Francis I. He's arrested for having Protestant sympathies. In order to escape prison, he flees to Basel, Switzerland. And it's there at age 26 that he first publishes his first draft of what became the Institutes of the Christian Religion. I've got Henry Beveridge's translation. Beveridge was a Puritan. It's not as big as you might think. When you hear it quoted, you think, oh, it must be a multi-volume thing. No, it's about less than 1,000 pages here. And as one professor of mine in seminary said, he didn't like Beveridge because it leaks. The translation is not his favorite, so there's a newer, more tightly translated version of that. But nonetheless, you can pick that up and get the basic gist of what it's about. But he does this at age 26, which is pretty incredible to think about. And the original version of it was kind of like, people carry the pocket constitutions around now, so they have. This was made to fit within a coat pocket, so that you could carry it surreptitiously; it would not be noticed. So it's a rather thin volume, but the original title to it was The Institute of the Christian Religion, containing almost the whole sum of piety and whatever it is necessary to know in the doctrine of salvation, a work very well worth reading by all persons zealous for piety, and lately published a preface to the most Christian king of France, in which this book is presented to him as a confession of faith.
Wow.
Nice title. And this is pretty common for things to be dedicated to a king or a prince or a duke or whatever. And you even find this. I've got Calvin's commentaries sitting on my shelf in there, and at the beginning of each volume, there's a dedication to some marquis or duke or prince or king. And so this is pretty common practice. So the form that we have that today finally came about in 1559, so it took a while. Why don't we have anything from Zwingli like this? Well, he just wasn't much of a... He didn't write... It's not that he didn't write a whole lot, but he wrote everything that he wrote within the space of about 10 years, and it wasn't anything that could be considered, a big major work. So Calvin becomes the one who is a writer. So he goes from France to Basel, 1535, and then from Basel back to Strasbourg. And where's Strasbourg anyway? France. Salzburg, Austria. Strasbourg, France. But it's in that little section that has gone back and forth between France and Germany over many, many years. But he goes to Strasbourg, and because Basel was German speaking and he's French speaking, so he goes back to Strasbourg, that's his intent anyway. But instead of going straight, he follows this kind of circuitous route through Geneva with the intention of spending one night. But in Geneva, he encounters a man by the name of William Farel, who's this red-bearded, piercing-eyed person. And Farel, it says, one scholar says, arrived as a refugee from France, a fiery red-bearded Elijah bellowing at the priests of Baal. And it's Farel that sticks his finger in Calvin's face and says, if you go to Strasbourg, you're going to be disobeying God. You better stay here. We need you here. His words were this: "May God condemn your repose and the calm you seek for study, if before such a great need you withdraw and refuse your succor," that is aid and help. So he ended up not going to Strasbourg. I mean, you know, Calvin is very meek, very mild, very retiring kind of person. He's not standing up to Pharaoh. He says, "Oh, almost like, if you say so, you know, I'll stay. I don't really want to stay." But he did, and because of that, the church would never be the same. So he stays in Geneva there for a while, a couple of years, and starts getting into it with the city government. And church and state begin to get entangled, of course. And so the city magistrates don't like Calvin's desire for a pure church membership. Because remember, when you're talking about being a Christian and being a member of the, a citizen, there's very, very little difference. Your allegiance to God and your allegiance to the state are mixed, allegiance to the king. And so Calvin starts, trying to bring church discipline to the Protestant church there, and the city government's really not having it. So in 1538, he finally does go to Strasbourg. But before he does that, he has already done a lot to institute what we think of as reforms, biblical preaching. And I'll talk a little bit more about just how much he spent in study and in preaching and everything. But he institutes all that, but he has to leave, and he spends 3 years then in Strasbourg. So now he finally makes it to Strasbourg. And it's there that he marries a widow with her 2 children, and that is Idelette, his wife, who becomes his wife. That's 1538. So by this time, Calvin is a 29-year-old man. 3 years later, the Genevan authorities realized, oh, we made a mistake. We want you back. So he comes back, and everybody's expecting that his first Sunday in the pulpit, he's just going to let him have it. Just lambast the city authorities, the magistrates. But famously, what he does is he opens the Bible and he picks up with the verse that he left off at 3 years before in his regular exposition of the Word. They were, to say the least, surprised to hear that resuming of expository preaching at that very text, which really bears pretty powerful witness to his theology of the Word, his submission to the Word. Rather than being petty about things, he stuck very close to the Word and maintained this rigorous preaching schedule. For 23 years in Geneva, he preached expositorily 2 sermons from the New Testament every Sunday. 1 sermon from the Old Testament every day during the week on alternating weeks. So every other week, you have a full week, full preaching schedule, every day preaching through the Old Testament. And then weekly preaching through the New Testament. And all that in addition to just the pastoring and counseling and teaching and corresponding with thousands of people that he really had an affinity for and who looked to him for leadership. And all this in the midst of just intense physical suffering. Allow me to read you just a little bit of his what he talks about here. A few months before his death, he wrote to his doctors talking about this time during his life, which was a few years before. At that time I was not attacked by arthritic pains, knew nothing of the stone or the gravel. I was not tormented with the gripings of the colic, nor afflicted with hemorrhoids, nor threatened with the expectoration of blood. At present, all these ailments, as it were, in troops, assail me. As soon as I recovered from a quartan ague, I don't know what that is, ague, I was seized with severe and acute pains in the calves of my legs, which after being partially relieved, returned a second and third time. At last, they degenerated into a disease in my articulations, which spread from my feet to my knees. An ulcer in the hemorrhoid veins long caused me excruciating sufferings. Intestinal ascarides subjected me to painful titillations, though I am now relieved from this vermicular disease. But immediately after, in the course of last summer, I had an attack of nephritis. As I could not endure the jolting motion of horseback, I was conveyed into the country in a litter. On my return, I wished to accomplish a part of the journey on foot. I had scarcely proceeded a mile when I was obliged to repose myself in consequence of lassitude in the reins.
I can see how people appreciate that Zwingli didn't write us.
Yeah. And then, to my surprise, I discovered a discharged blood instead of urine. As soon as I got home, I took to bed. The nephritis gave me exquisite pain, from which I only obtained partial relief by the application of remedies. And at length, not without the most painful strainings, I ejected a calculus, which in some degree mitigated my sufferings. Yeah, boy, that was probably painful. But such was its size that it lacerated the urinary canal, and copious discharge of blood followed. This hemorrhage could only be arrested by an injection of milk through a syringe. Medicine in those days. After that, I ejected several others, and the oppressive numbness of the reins is a sufficient symptom that there are some remains of uric calculus. It is a fortunate thing, however, that minute or at least moderately sized particles still continue to be emitted. My sedentary way of life, to which I am condemned by the gout
Oh my goodness.
in my feet, precludes all hopes of a cure. I'm also prevented from taking exercise on horseback by my hemorrhoids. Add to my other complaints that whatever nourishment I take imperfectly digested turns into phlegm, which by its density sticks like paste to my stomach. So, all that happened, and before Calvin's death, he had lots of physical ailments. Yet he maintained this excruciating schedule. He was carried to the pulpit for his last sermon. He was carried on a bed to preach his last time.
Laying aside.
And during that time in Geneva became, everybody thinks of Geneva as sort of becoming this sort of idyllic example of what it meant for a Christian city to be. It really wasn't that, but there was close cooperation between church and state. One of the things, though, that there had to be compromise on was the frequency of communion. Calvin had a preference for it being much more frequently, like every week. But the state of the medieval church had been once a year for people to take communion. And so there was a compromise. Do you know what the compromise was? Once a quarter. And thereafter, Baptists and everybody else have had quarterly communion. Thank you very much, Calvin, or not Calvin, thank you very much, Geneva City Council, for that. So, poking a little bit of fun there, but really, this is the kind of thing that was going on. There were a lot of compromises and things that had to be done, because there was so much cooperation between the church and the city. And remember, people didn't think about religious freedom. They didn't have an idea of, we have allegiance to the king, we have allegiance to the state, but we just want to practice our religion in freedom and in the way that we see fit. That is a very post-Enlightenment idea. It's really a very American idea, because that's really what a lot of the wars during this time were being fought over. Whose allegiance is where does your allegiance going to lie? So, for example, in Switzerland, even today, there are Catholic and Protestant cantons in Switzerland. That's kind of like a geographic, like a county or whatever you want to call it. And so it's a thing that we don't think too much about, but is a very big thing then. So let's move on now to the writings. As I mentioned earlier, the Institutes are probably the most widely known of everything, but he wrote commentaries on many, many books of the Bible. He didn't write a commentary on Revelation. He did preach from Revelation. But there are other books that he didn't write commentaries on. But I would say most of the commentaries were out of the fruit of his preaching through Old Testament, New Testament books. And they're, of course, still in print today. You can find them online. But the four parts of the Institutes are as follows. It's divided into 4 sections. One is the knowledge of God the Creator. The second section is the knowledge of God the Redeemer. Third is the way in which we receive the grace of Christ, its benefits and effects. That said receive, it's kind of hard to read.
Pardon me.
Bless you.
Thank you. Sorry.
And then the external means by which God invites us into the society of Christ. That's an interesting one.
Bless you.
External
No, just look at me.
means by which God invites us
It's working now.
into the society of Christ. So a lot of people think of or consider the Institutes to be like a work of systematic theology, but it's really not so much. He doesn't really have it's not a systematic work so much as it is a work of piety. He is really writing for the benefit of helping Christians to live Christianly, to understand the Bible, certainly, and to have this knowledge of God. But one of the greatest sections in the whole work is his section on prayer. It's just incredible. And so, you just like any human work, you've got to kind of read through it and take the good with the bad and spit out the bones and swallow the meat and so forth. But just this is the kind of work that we're talking about here with Calvin. Just a few things, maybe ways to quote from this, and then we'll bring things to a conclusion. Though Calvin is widely and rightly known for his emphasis on the sovereignty of God, this does not give the full picture. For Calvin, God's sovereignty points to God's majesty and glory. In his own words, although God lacks nothing, still the principal aim he had in creating men was that his name might be glorified in them. And were this not so, what would become of the many evidences of Scripture which tell us that the sovereign aim of our salvation is the glory of God? So Calvin was interested in drawing people out of idolatry, out of the idolatry of the current religion, and into an accurate and scriptural knowledge of who God is, his majesty, his glory, his splendor. And in doing so, in helping people to focus on God, to begin thinking about his sovereignty. Of course, there's all kinds of things we could say too. His most people think of other things when they think of Calvin, doctrine of election and predestination and so forth. But these are all just a part of the whole puzzle. And Calvin's greatest concern was that the church truly be a church of Christ, not